Hello, everyone. This is MaNishtana for TribeHerald. I'm here with Dr. Ira Sheskin.
Right.
Dr. Ira Sheskin, who's recently written an article for Jewish Philanthropy, How Many Jews of Color Are There? And in this piece, the doctor says that the commonly thrown around demographic number of American Jews of color being 12 to 15% of the American Jewish population is inflated, and that the number is actually 6%. It's gotten a little bit of buzz and people are talking about it. So I just want to jump in with a question that I've seen repeated across several different platforms. And that question is, what is sort of the point of your article? Like, what was it trying to say? A sentiment that, again, many Jews of color have had in response to this article is that the concerns of Jews of color and inclusion isn't proportionate to the number of percentage of us that exist. And so pretty much what was your goal, or what's the goal or point of that article?
Well, as a social scientist, I have actually a professional responsibility that if there's a number out there that's just clearly wrong, to correct that number. Apparently the number, first of all, I'm all for inclusion. The Jewish community has not treated this issue to the extent that they should. All behind that, our article includes references to 4 different Jewish organizations that are working on behalf of Jews of color. It includes praise for the Miami Jewish Federation, which passed a motion and has an inclusivity committee now, etc. Apparently the number is important. How do we know that? Well, the Jewish Field Building Initiative, which is one of those organizations that advocates for Jews of color, commissioned this study. And that study came out about a year ago now. And that study came to the conclusion that 12 to 15%, at least 12 to 15% of American Jews are Jews of color. They did consult the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey. They did consult the National Jew of 1990 and of 2000. And they did consult the Pew study of 2013. Now, they consulted those, but came to the conclusion of 12 to 15% in that report without even presenting the alternative evidence that it's really more like 6%. When I read the 12 to 15%, I kind of scratched my head. I belonged to a synagogue my entire life, and I understand that some Jews of color are going to belong to different synagogues, etc. The first synagogue I belonged to had none. The second one had 1 or 2 and some adopted children. The one I'm members of now with 650 families has none. Okay. And I said to myself, 12 to 15% means that about 1 out of 6 Jews you run into in this country are Jews of color. It kind of doesn't seem right to me. But as a social scientist, I don't go with what seems. So since 1990, we've had 3 well-done national studies. 2 of them were sponsored by the Jewish Federations of North America, although they had different names earlier. And the latest study is the one done by Pew in 2013. Now, everyone out there who's a researcher will agree that the Pew Research Center in Washington is one of the top survey research for operations. They're a nonprofit or not-for-profit in the country. There's no question about it. When the Pew Research Center Profile of Jewish Americans came out in 2013, everybody in the Jewish community said this is extremely well done and accepted the results. So when 12 to 15% did not sound right to me, first thing I did was go to Pew, and they've got 6%. And then I was involved in a major way with the two national studies done in 1990 and 2000. So I went back and looked at those, and I reran the data to make sure. I went and used the computer program, didn't look in the reports, reran it, checked the reports. The percentage of American Jews, according to the three most reliable studies that we have who are Jews of color, in the 6 to 8% range since 1990. And because the Jewish population has been increasing and we kind of get slightly different percentages, 6% is the same as 7% because of the margin of error. I came to the conclusion that the percentage of Jews who are Jews of color has been around 6 to 8% since 1990. And the number has been somewhere around 420,000 since 1990. And neither of those has changed very much. Now, if the Jewish Field Building Initiative was interested in knowing how many there are, and they came up with a number that was wrong, we should not proceed in the community on the basis of a wrong number. The number is clearly more like 400,000. But as I said in the article, even if one Jew is made to feel uncomfortable in a Jewish setting, we should be concerned about it. And I am concerned about it. And we should go forward the way we were going forward before, moving toward being concerned about this. And I think what's happened is that as people have discovered, those who aren't of color like me, except for white these days, okay, as people have discovered that there are many more Jews of color out there than they thought, I think there's a lot more discussion of it. One of my friends, who's Warie's fellow researcher, Helen Kim, is Korean. Her husband is Jewish. She's converted, so she's racially Korean, but Jewish too. And so I think we're simply more aware. The 12 to 15% as well came out of a study that said it was 12%. That same study says there are more Jews in North Carolina than there are in Connecticut. So there are problems with that methodology. So we have a better study that comes out with 6%, a study that I think has a problem with this methodology that says 12%, and a researcher who takes the 12% and turns it into at least 12 to 15%. So the purpose of the article was to simply correct the record, okay, and to move forward with the right data. Apparently, advocate organizations for Jews of color believe that we need a good number. I'm giving them the good number. I'm sorry it's not higher, okay, but it's not. That's what it is. It's somewhere around 400,000.
I found very interesting things of what you were answering just now. Firstly, the 12 to 15 number not hitting right because you've been part of several synagogues and haven't seen that many Jews of color. So that seems to already have an implicit bias that just because you're not seeing Jews of color engaged in Jewish life, that number somehow seems wrong. Also, you repeatedly referred to the earlier 3 surveys and said they were the best surveys done on the American Jewish community, but Jews of color have notoriously and consistently been undercounted by Jewish surveys. So I'm a little baffled as how those numbers you're saying are the concrete numbers when researchers at University of Stanford and University of San Francisco also come to the conclusion that the Jewish community has consistently been inconsistent with how to tabulate Jews of color in the American Jewish community.
Okay. I have not only been involved with 2 of the national studies, but I've done 53 local Jewish community studies since 1982. I've got a lot of experience with this. There is no way that I would reject the 12 to 15% on the basis of my own feeling. I'm not President Trump who says it's in my gut. I'm just saying that when I read that, it didn't seem right. So I didn't do any original research. I did not do my own survey. I went to what was available out there. The best thing we have and the most recent thing we have is Pew 2013, and it says 6%. Now, you're right. There could be somewhat of an undercount if Jews of color are less likely to participate, right, in surveys. Now, understand how I don't think that's true for Pew 2013. I'm not even sure it's true for other surveys, because if I were a Jew of color and I thought we were being underestimated, I might be more likely to participate. Not less likely to participate, but more likely. In addition, understand how Pew 2013 was done. For the entire country, for both cell phones and landlines, they took every area code in the United States and every 3-digit exchange code after that. So like my phone number begins 954-435. You put 4-digit numbers at the end and dial until you find a Jew. So during the first about 5 minutes of the study, people don't even know it's a Jewish survey. Okay, they don't know that. So there's no reason to, there is actually some reason to believe that that people of color would be less likely to stay on the phone and do that. But that gets fixed with something called weighting factors. Weighting factors, we know that more educated people are more likely to do surveys. Less educated people are less likely to do surveys. And unfortunately, in this country, it means that yes, Blacks and Hispanics are probably less likely to participate in these surveys. But the survey was not introduced.
That's a wild assumption.
No, it's not. It's an assumption made by every single survey research firm, and it's been shown to be true. Do you know how? We know, for example, right now that about 13% of Americans are Black. According to the census, we've got good information on that. And we can look at surveys, which when you do them at random, you get less than 13% Black. So what happens is they take and add weights to make it to look to the computer like 13% is Black. I've written a book on survey research. I teach an entire course on research methods, which spends probably 8 of the 14 weeks on surveys. I teach another course on beginning statistics and advanced statistics. I know what I'm talking about here. You cannot assume it is possible that Jews of color are underrepresented in Jewish surveys. But by the time people found out it was a Jewish survey with Pew, they were probably a good 5 minutes into the questions. Non-Jews were then thanked, and Jews continued with the survey. So could it be that Pew underestimated? I'll buy that. Let's say they underestimated by 50%. Surveys are far from perfect. That's lesson number 1 in my class. So instead of 6, let's say gross underestimation might put it at 9. It's not going to put it at least 12 to 15.
That's assuming that the Jews of color that you're speaking to are also identifying as Jews of color. It was part of an article for the New York Times, myself and my colleague Gitz Jordan, where we said a Jew of color child is a lot less likely to identify as a Jew of color adult, just because of things of implicit bias, because of racial discrimination, and because of other factors. So even if reaching these people, and you did reach a Jew of color, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would identify as such. That doesn't change the number of the population just because they aren't identifying. They still are Jewish.
Well, first, every survey out there, you're going to do a survey of Hispanics, you ask, do you consider yourself Hispanic? You're going to do a survey of Jews, you ask if they consider themselves Jewish. However, people with a Jewish mother and a Jewish father, or a Jewish father, Pew was done a little differently, but it had the same result as the 1990 study and the 2000 study. You could qualify for the 2000 study by the following questions. What is your religion? They said Jewish, they were in. Okay. Other than religion, do you consider yourself Jewish in any way? Was your mother Jewish? Was your father Jewish? Both of those studies got the same results as Pew. So if they don't look in the NJPS studies, the National Jewish Population Studies, if they didn't identify as Jewish today, which you're saying is more common among Jews of color, but they had a Jewish mother or a Jewish father, or they said they were raised Jewish, they were interviewed anyway. Listen, these studies were all planned by some of the best minds in the country. No one has a bias that they don't want to find Jews of color. If you know my bias would be, anytime I do a survey and I come up with something people weren't expecting, I'm happy in the following way. If you do a survey and you come up with, oh, we knew that on everything, people say, why did we spend the money? So if I have any implicit bias, it would be to say, wow, wouldn't that be great if we got a high percentage of blacks? But there's no bias here. You ask the question, people answer the question. And yes, different types of people will react to questions in different ways. And I'm willing to concede that the 6% from Pew, given the margin of error on that, and given that maybe Jews of color are less likely to answer surveys, even though we correct for educational levels, every poll does that. Every poll. All the presidential polls do that. The ones that didn't mispredicted the last election because they had people who didn't know what they were doing. Gallup does, Harris does, SSRS does, Monmouth University does. Everybody corrects for education. And that should take care of that bias. Even if it's 9% and not 6%, it's not at least 12 to 15%. That doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with the problem. We should definitely deal with the problem, with any problem that exists in the Jewish community with inclusivity. Okay, I'm a flaming liberal in many ways. Okay, this has nothing to do with how we treat people. That's a different article. This article was to say that if a Jewish organization that advocates for Jews of color is concerned about the number enough that they hire a group to get that number, and then that group turns around, says, yes, we looked at Pew 2013, but doesn't even put the 6% in their report, that needs correcting. And that's all. We're correcting the record. We're not commenting. The issue is important, but that is not part of this article.
Again,
okay,
it's still based on surveys that have undercounted Jews of color.
How do you know that?
According to lead researcher Ira M, again from Stanford University.
Okay, you don't have to tell me about Ari. I've known Ari for 20 years. I've talked to him at the Association of Jewish Studies meetings. I'm a quantitative researcher. Okay, he hasn't done surveys. Nice guy. Okay. I'm at the University of Miami. We're not quite ranked with Stanford. Arnie Deshevsky's at the University of Connecticut, not quite ranked with Stanford, but that doesn't mean anything. Okay. I've done so many of these studies. I know much more about surveys. Now, one of the studies that Ari criticized was my Miami study. Why? Because we asked if you were Sephardic. Well, we've got 3 Sephardic synagogues in Miami. It made sense. We asked if people were Hispanic or not. That makes sense. We've got a really large Hispanic Jewish population in Miami. I asked the committee that helps design the questionnaire. I don't just make up the questions myself. Every time you do a study, there's always an advisory committee at the Federation. Right now, I'm helping the New York Federation on their study, which got postponed because of COVID-19. And we are asking race, and we are asking Hispanic. Okay? And we're also asking everybody if they consider themselves to be a Jew of color, separately from asking them race and Hispanic status. And that's what you need to do that question right. In Miami, I asked the committee if they wanted this question, and they didn't. And here's why. Everyone there agreed that in Miami, where we have no black synagogues, that the percentage of Jews in Miami who are liable to be Jews of color by race would be so low, and you've only got 20 minutes of questions, that asking a question about Jews of color would be a waste of time. One of the rules in survey research is you ask a question because you don't know whether the right answer is 5%, 10%, or 30%. You don't ask a question to find out if something is 0.5% or 1.5%. Of course, in survey research, they're the same number because one is within the margin of error of the other. So they really are the same number. So do we ask a question on a race question on a survey to find out if something is 1 or 2%? You don't. Secondly, let's even find out at the extreme end. It turns out that it's 2%. Miami, we did a lot of interviews. We did 2,000 interviews. At 2%, we would have come up with 40 interviews with Jews of color by race. By Hispanic, no problem. We got loads of Hispanic Jews in Miami. By race, we would have had 40. That's not enough to do any analysis. I can't tell you their income. I can't tell you whether they belong to synagogues or not. I can't tell you whether they feel a part of the Miami Jewish community on the basis of 40 surveys, because the margin of error is something like plus or minus 15%. So there are good reasons why local Jewish community studies don't always ask about race. We are doing it in New York. They're doing it in Chicago. They're doing it they rightfully did it in San Francisco. But Ari's complaining that we don't ask that question. I always suggest it when I work on it with these committees. They almost always reject the question because they don't think it could possibly be above 2% in an Omaha, Nebraska, or in Indianapolis, Indiana. And so we generally have not been asking the race question. In addition, Ari looked at my data from Miami and came up with, missed the fact that some Hispanic Jews are Sephardic and some Hispanic Jews are Ashkenazi. Okay? He missed that. And he added things together as if they were mutually exclusive categories, which they're not, and criticized my research for that reason. He criticized me for not asking a question that the community rightfully did not want to spend one of their precious questions on. Of course, there's a limit about how many times you keep people on the phone. And then he added together two numbers that you can't add together without eliminating the overlap. Okay? So yeah, there's quite a problem just because someone's from Stanford. And Ari's a nice guy, and he's done some great research in his life. This was not it. Okay?
You seem to be disproving your points, because if the question isn't being asked, then those potential Jews of colors aren't being counted. So inherently, that's automatically undercounting Jews of color. Also, that's with the assumption that it's only going to be 1 or maybe 2%. If the question isn't asked, you don't know what the percentage is of those communities.
You're right. Okay, you're not wrong about that. But the chances that it was any higher than 2% are trivial. Now, the national study, we did it. We're not talking about the local studies now. I'm talking about why, because you can't take the data from Miami and extend it out to the whole country. The national study asked the question. The local studies have not always asked the question, but for good reason. And Ari's right. They haven't always asked the question in the same way. And it would be helpful if they did. But that if the argument is between 6% and at least 12 to 15%, if the argument is between 400,000 and just over 400,000 and just over 1 million, I'm trying to tell the world that the real answer is just over 400,000. And there's no bias there. That's what it is. I just took the Pew study and applied it and said, here's what we got. And it's very different from 12 to 15%. I never ask a Nicaraguan how many Nicaraguans there are. And I never ask an Asian how many Asians there are in their city. And you should never ask Jews. So many people think Jews are 25 or 30% of the population. Okay? You need, surveys are difficult. It's getting harder and harder to keep people on the phone. I'm willing to say that maybe it's not 400,000, maybe it's even 600,000. But it's certainly not over 1 million. It just isn't. Many people you see are Black Jews. I have no doubt that that number is going to increase in the future. And I love it. Okay? I'm thrilled that we have Jews of different hues, right? That's the name of one of the organizations. But you can't look at these numbers and say there are 1 million Black Jews in this country. It just isn't happening. Even allowing for them to be less likely to join synagogues, Jewish organizations, etc., mainstream anyway. They're less likely to be on the Federation's mailing list. But we don't use the Federation's mailing list in the national studies. It would be impossible to collect 140-something Federation mailing lists, merge them and purge them, and we never do that. We use random digit dialing for a national study. Today, that's beginning to change to another procedure, but that's besides the point, because Pew was done with random digit dialing. Pew cost a lot of money. I know what it is. I'm not allowed to tell you. The National Jewish Population Survey in 2000 cost just under $6 million. Okay? With the smartest people in the country being involved with it in terms of survey research. And all three agree.
Again, I'm not exactly sure where you're getting the confidence in these numbers from questions that may or may not be constructed in a way to give the answers that you're looking for.
The questions are constructed using the same questions as the US Census. It's the same questions as the census that has billions of dollars of budget and does all kinds of focus groups to get the questions right. In fact, I helped the Census Bureau put together a focus group here in Miami, trying to figure out how to ask about Middle Eastern, North African people. And they decided in the end to not make it a separate racial category. The Census Bureau does extensive research on how to ask questions. Extensive research. The Jewish studies that have asked race, they use the census question. And that is not even an opinion question. You know, it's, do you consider, are you Black/African American, right? White, Asian, Pacific Islander? The standard categories. So that doesn't wash. That can wash if you have an opinion question. Sometimes you can change one word in an opinion question and get a totally different response. That doesn't count for race. It doesn't count for Hispanic, non-Hispanic. It will be interesting in the New York study, which won't be out for a while now because we've delayed it. We're asking the typical census questions, the exact same wording. And then we're asking, do you consider yourself to be a Jew of color? And it'll be very interesting to cross-tabulate this, okay? And see, do you have people who say they're racially Black and then are you a Jew of color? They say no.
There are Jews of color that don't self-identify as Jews of color.
Right, fine, we'll know that. We're gonna know what that is. And I'm not saying the 400,000 is an exact number. And I'm saying to you, there's a margin of error. And I'm willing to admit that it could be that Jews of color are less likely to stay on the phone and do the interview. And that maybe instead of 6%, it might be as high as 9. But it's not 12 to 15 or more. It just isn't.
You've named a wide variety of variables that can, at least to me, I could see it shifting the number in a completely different direction. Not even taking into account people who don't self-identify as Jews of color or don't identify as Jewish anymore.
Okay, but here's the next question for you, okay? Jews of color may answer that if you're a black Jew, when you're asked, do you consider yourself black, white, or Asian? You can answer that wrong? You're not going to answer that wrong. Now, when you're then asked later in the survey, are you Jewish? Right? If you say no, then you're not a Jew. Unless, as NJPS did, it followed it up with mother or father and interviewed people who had a Jewish mother or father. Then they were considered to be Jewish. Rabbi, we've done this extremely carefully. I've been involved in Jewish demographic research since 1982. Okay? I teach this. I publish on this. I'm one of the editors of the American Jewish Yearbook. I'm boasting here. But I'm trying to tell you that there are some things, when I'm listening to a biologist or a chemist explain something, I don't think I know more about them than they do because I'm a biological being. I listen to the experts, and that's what we need to do. And the experts in this case know just what a problem survey research can be. It is a problem. But it's not, there are not over 1 million Jews of color in this country, allowing for the maximum possible error in these statistics. If you were researching what percentage of American Jews are Jews of color, and you had one that said 12% and another that said 6%, and you're trying to put forward a report about how many Jews of color there are, would you leave out the fact that Pew came up with 6%, when certainly in the organized Jewish world, everybody knows about Pew? And you leave out the 6%. Does that make sense to you? I mean, you need to put it in. Even if you want to come to the conclusion that the 12% is a better estimate, you need, as an academic researcher, to present the 6%. So if there's bias anywhere, think about this. You're working for an organization, and I don't know that Ari did this, okay? I don't want to be quoted saying this is what happened. So take it in general. You're working for an organization that advocates for population group X. They would like a high number. So you look at the existing research and pick out the highest number and then extend it a little further. Is there bias there? Sure. What I did was say, 3 surveys since 1990. All are saying 6 to 8%. And you know what? You may be right. They may be underestimating a little bit. So instead of 400,000, I'll yield and say that maybe the number is 800,000. Maybe. 400, 600 rather, not 800. Maybe it's 600,000, but it's not over 1 million. Now, keep in mind, too, that one of the reasons the percentage hasn't gone up since 1990 is we now have probably at least 600,000 Jews in this country from the former Soviet Union who weren't here back until about 1990. So if there's been, even if there has been some increase in Jews of color, the adding 800,000 Russian Jews, none of whom are probably Jews of color, is one of the reasons the percentage didn't go up. okay? So that's probably why the percentages stayed the same, but the fact that the numbers stayed the same is the fact that maybe 1990 is slightly low, and this one is slightly high, this one's slightly low, so the number remains somewhere around 400,000 for, what is it, 30 years. Got to listen to the experts. And not just me. Not just me, okay?
I find that quite ironic since I'm intimately familiar with my community.
With who? With what?
With my community.
Oh, I'm sure you are. And look, I don't even say we're glad to have you, because that would imply that you're different from the rest of the Jewish community. And I guess in some ways you are, but I consider you part of the American Jewish community, plain and simple. I've known Black Jews since I was a kid. I'm going to be 70 years old in a month. Can't believe it. And I've known Black Jews since I was a kid. And they should be part of the community. And I get very upset when I hear about people who are, what, you Jewish? Right? And I think they're well-meaning people when they do that. But I can understand why it would make people feel uncomfortable. My last synagogue, we had one Black Jew there. I talked to him a lot. He was a good guy. He was a friend. He gave a class when we had like a limud type of thing on how he came to Judaism, discovered he had like a Jewish grandfather or something like that, and decided to become Jewish. And he was a great guy. There's no animosity here. The question is, if you need a number, 400,000 is a lot closer to the truth than 1 million.
Well, you just brought forth a very interesting example. This gentleman you just mentioned discovered that he had a Jewish grandfather.
Right. But white Jews do that too.
So
all the time.
If you're being asked on a survey question, if you're Jewish or if your parents are Jewish and you don't know that you have that grandfather, you are still
right.
in color and you're still not identifying and still not being caught in that net.
Right. But neither are white Jews. Because nobody, how many people tell us that, well, I'm not Jewish, but I think I have some Jewish heritage. I can remember my grandmother lighting candles on Friday night when I was a little girl. My mother told me that they used to cover the mirrors when someone died in her grandparents' house. But nobody interviews as Jewish today anybody whose Jewish heritage goes back to the grandparents. Israel will take it, okay? But Jewish surveys stop at the previous generation. And I can tell you, nobody advocates.
So they're potentially missing people.
White and Black as well.
Okay.
And so that doesn't impact the ultimate percentage, does it? It doesn't impact the ultimate percentage.
It does yield a higher number.
Well, you have somebody with a Jewish grandparent who's been Baptist for 2 generations or 3 generations. They have a Jewish grandparent. They don't identify as Jewish. Mother wasn't Jewish, father wasn't Jewish, they're Baptists. You want to count those as Jews of color because they've got 1/8 or 1/16 Jewish heritage?
Well, if they have a Jewish grandmother, then they're just Jewish.
Not if their mother was not Jewish. Suppose their mother converted. Then they're not Jewish. Then they're not Jewish. But we're not talking about, we may be talking, there may be some large numbers there, but there's in fact, I would think reason to believe that there's more of that in the white population than in the Black population. But I'm guessing that. When I'm guessing, I'll tell you, okay? I'm not guessing at the 400,000. I'm telling you that research is not perfect. The 400,000 is so much closer to the truth than 1 million is.
Well, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree on methodology.
Okay, but I would point out that you're entitled to agree but disagree with your doctor on medical treatment. But you really ought to believe your doctor. If we were talking about halakha, I'd go with you.
You're talking about my community.
Right. I understand that, but that doesn't make you an expert on.
It does make me hugely aware of the different ways that Jews of color either identify, don't show up, don't feel comfortable showing up, and or are discounted when they do show up.
And that's why I'm willing to say to you that if Pew comes out with about 420,000, if you want to allow for that phenomenon, fine. We could raise it as far as 600,000 maybe. But it's not a million. It's not a million. Period. Can't be. And, you know, I'm not the only person who's going to tell you that. It's simply not a million. Which is what 12 to 50, what 15% applies. Okay?
We'll just have to agree to disagree.
Okay, fine. Don't do that with your doctor, though. Okay? If your doctor tells you you need a treatment, do it. Okay? Anything else, Rabbi?
I noted a point that you had in your article. It said it should be noted that many Jews who might identify as Hispanic are in fact Ashkenazi and are much less likely to be of color. If you could talk to me more through about that delineation that you made.
Oh, sure.
Ashkenazi?
Right. First, and I added it. It's in the forward now, too, by the way, the article. They picked it up. And before I sent it to them, I added one sentence to make something clearer on the basis of some comment that I got on E-Jewish Philanthropy. Okay? People are what they say they are. Okay? Now, there's a significant overlap in Miami and elsewhere between Hispanic and Sephardic Jews. But there's also a significant non-overlap as well. They're two different categories. And very often people use Hispanic interchangeably with Sephardic, and that's just not the case. Example, in Miami, we have a whole bunch of Jews whose grandparents or parents escaped the Holocaust to places like Cuba and Argentina. Okay? They were Polish Jews or Hungarian Jews or Romanian Jews who went and lived in Cuba, Argentina, Peru, etc., and now have moved to Miami. Very few of them, if they were asked, do you consider yourself a Jew of color, would probably say yes. Very few. They're of Ashkenazi background. And they almost certainly would not say they're a Jew of color. See, the first thing that you need to do is to define what you mean by a Jew of color. And if you include all Hispanic Jews in that definition, you're going to overestimate the percentage of people who are Jews of color, unless you want to say all Hispanics are Jews of color. If you turn around and ask those people, are you a Jew of color? They're going to look at you funny. And I know my community. I live in Miami. Okay? They're white. They don't look Hispanic. In fact, one of the people in my history department years ago made a movie called Hotel Cuba. And it was all about the Jews who moved from Eastern Europe just before, during the Holocaust, to Cuba, stayed there for like 10 to 15 years. And then when Castro came along in 1959, 60, 61, they came to the United States. Their families lived in Cuba for 20 years. Some of them were born in Cuba, grew up speaking Spanish. Others spoke Spanish when they got here because they lived in Cuba for 20 years. Okay. In the US Census, they'll probably identify themselves as Hispanic. But if you ask them if they're a Jew of color, which by the way is a relatively, the of color thing is relatively new as a term, right? Okay. If you ask them if they were a Jew of color, they're almost certainly going to say, what? And are they? I don't know. They're white Ashkenazi Jews from Poland, let's say, who happen to speak Spanish. So that qualifies them in the census to say, yes, I'm Hispanic. But it doesn't mean they're Jews of color. So the first place you really have to start, if you're going to talk about Jews of color, is to define who you mean, okay? And who qualifies as a Jew of color. The best way of doing that is probably with the question, do you consider yourself to be a Jew of color? Okay, that's probably the best way. But because you say you're Hispanic doesn't mean you consider yourself to be of color, either physically or in your head. Where are your grandparents from? Poland. You speak Spanish. Yeah. Are you Hispanic? Yeah.
Although Ashkenazi doesn't inherently mean white either, so.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And it also doesn't necessarily mean there are Sephardic Jews, for example, in Bulgaria. And my friend Sergio Della Pergola, who's like Israel's, Sergio Della Pergola is Israel's chief demographer. They don't have such a category, but no one would argue with that. He's an Italian Jew. And Italian Jews aren't sure whether they're Sephardic or Ashkenazi. Okay. So that's what we're talking about there. In other words, that 6% even includes some people who, if you looked at them or you asked them, wouldn't even identify themselves as being Jews of color. I think that, the organization that Lashon, B'chol Lashon, right? That my friend Gary Tobin started. I know him. I know his wife. I support that organization. They changed their name to diverse from Jews of color. They are emphasizing diverse Jews. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a better term. Now, if you want to talk diverse, you got to take the 6% and probably add 10% Sephardic. Okay? Eliminate the overlap with some Hispanics, you might be looking at 15%. If you want to include Sephardic Jews, many of the Israelis who've come here are Sephardic. But are Sephardic Jews Jews of color? If you want to define them that way, I suppose they are, right?
Mizrahi and Sephardim, some self-identify Jews of color and some don't.
Exactly. Okay, and that's why no one's adding in Sephardic Jews. There are plenty of, probably a small minority of Sephardic Jews are Jews of color. So you pick them up if you ask race, but you don't pick them up as, you can't add all the Sephardic Jews into Jews of color. By the way, that's one of the things that Ari, again, he's a good friend and a good researcher. That's one of the things he did. In my study, he assumed that all the Sephardic Jews were Jews of color. Not true. You know, my study in Miami in 2004, I did it, the last one I did was 2014. If we lose connection here, it's thundering and lightning outside here, okay? My Miami study in 2004, when it came up with statistics somewhat like the ones that I have in the article here, which are newer, I was at a meeting where, because I'm active in the Federation as well, I was at a meeting where people were looking at one another and said, we are an incredibly diverse community, and we need to recognize that. Now, that's a big change from the 1950s, when the Miami Federation set up a separate Latin division, okay? And many people didn't view the Jews from Cuba as really being Jewish. Very different attitude. The theme of that year's annual meeting, which are usually attended by 1,200 or so people, was into the tent. And that is, and they talked about it, that we have to realize that we're a big tent and everyone needs to feel included in that big tent. Okay? So, yeah, there's the first thing that you need to do is to define what you mean by Jew of color. And what I'm suggesting is that assuming Sephardic Jews are Jews of color, some are, some aren't. Yet in that report, Ari, at least in his, section on Miami, assumes they're Jews of color. I don't think most are. In fact, it's certainly not all of them, by far.
Oh, here we are.
Well, anything else? I mean, I've got until, let me see. My next meeting is with the head of AJC at 11 tomorrow, so I have to have a whole bunch of hours.
Well, I have some other calls to make on my end, but thank you again for.
And anybody else, by the way, who wants to talk about this, I'm happy to do it. Okay? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right. Bye-bye.